A celebration turns sour. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and the Williams family was in high spirits. It had been weeks since they'd had a reason to celebrate, and today they were marking a new beginning. Derek Williams, a former decorated officer, had just been appointed as the new police chief in the small town of Maplewood. He, his wife Angela, and their two children, Josh and Christine, had worked hard for this moment, and it felt like a triumph for the entire family. They had invited friends, family, and a few neighbors over for a backyard BBQ, a joyous gathering to commemorate Derek's new role and the exciting future ahead. The backyard buzzed with laughter, the sound of sizzling burgers on the grill, and the playful shouts of children as they darted in and out of the inflatable bounce house. Angela, ever the gracious host, was making sure everyone had enough food and drink while Derek was manning the grill. The kids, Josh and Christine, were running around with their friends, faces lit up with excitement. The scene was picture perfect, a family celebrating a hard-earned victory. However, not everyone was pleased with the festivities. 2 houses down, a different scene was unfolding inside the living room of Mrs. Gray, the Williams family's neighbor. Mrs. Gray, a woman in her late 60s, sat by her window, her lips pressed into a thin line as she glared out at the joyous scene in the Williams' backyard. She had never been fond of the Williams family ever since they moved into what she considered her neighborhood. They were new, they were different, and in her mind, it didn't belong. As the music played and the laughter of children grew louder, Mrs. Gray's irritation festered into anger. She saw herself as a guardian of the neighborhood, and in her eyes, the Williams family represented everything that was wrong with the world today. It wasn't just the party. It was the way they carried themselves, happy, unbothered, and confident. She felt overshadowed by their presence, like they were a reminder of how her own life had become stagnant and bitter. Her hand twitched as she reached for her phone. She had had enough. Surely the noise and the commotion were a disturbance to the peace. There were rules in this neighborhood, and she was sure the Williams family was violating them. But beneath the surface of her complaint lay something darker, a deep-seated prejudice that she hadn't even realized had consumed her thoughts. "They think they can just move in here and take over," Mrs. Gray muttered to herself. She picked up her phone, her fingers shaking with anger, and dialed the police. As the phone rang, she glanced out the window again, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Derek laughing with his friends. She spoke quickly when the dispatcher answered. "Yes, I'd like to report a noise disturbance," Mrs. Gray said, her voice dripping with indignation. "There's a party going on next door, and it's completely out of control. It's disturbing the whole neighborhood." The dispatcher asked for details, and Mrs. Gray was quick to exaggerate. "There are too many people. It's loud, it's disruptive, I'm sure it's violating some sort of ordinance." She hung up the phone with a sense of self-satisfaction. "That will show them," she muttered. But deep down, she wasn't satisfied. What she really wanted was to see the Williams family humbled, to see them reminded of their place. She imagined the police showing up, sternly ordering everyone to leave, and the Williams family left humiliated and ashamed in front of their guests. As Mrs. Gray sat back in her chair, still watching the party, the noise from the backyard continued, unaware of the storm that was about to roll in. The party is interrupted. Back at the party, Derek was flipping burgers on the grill, chatting with an old friend from the department when Angela approached him, a frown tugging at the corners of her mouth. She had just gotten off the phone with her sister, who was running late. "Honey, do you think we're being too loud?" Angela asked, glancing around the yard. The kids were still playing, the adults talking, but the noise didn't seem excessive to her. Derek smiled, shaking his head. "It's a celebration, Ange. We're not breaking any laws. It's a Saturday afternoon, and we've got every right to enjoy ourselves." He placed another burger on the grill. "Besides, we invited most of the neighbors. No one's complained." Angela nodded, though she still felt a little uneasy. She glanced toward Mrs. Gray's house and caught a glimpse of the older woman peering out her window, scowling. Angela sighed. She had always tried to be friendly with Mrs. Gray, waving whenever she saw her and even bringing over cookies after they first moved in. But the older woman had always been distant, if not downright cold. Just as Angela was about to push the thought away and focus on the party, she heard something that made her heart skip a beat, the distant wail of police sirens. Her eyes widened as she looked over at Derek, who had heard it too. The guests began to murmur, wondering if the sirens were headed their way. Derek's brow furrowed. "That's odd," he muttered. He placed the spatula down and moved to the front yard to see what was happening. Angela followed close behind, her heart racing. The sirens grew louder, and soon 2 police cars pulled up in front of the Williams home. The officers stepped out, their expressions serious, as they made their way toward the house. Angela's stomach churned with unease, and she glanced over at Derek, who remained calm and composed, though she could see the tension in his jaw. The guests, now curious and concerned, began to gather in the front yard, their conversations hushed as they watched the officers approach. The children clung to their parents, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Angela leaned over to Derek, whispering, "What's going on?" "We're not doing anything wrong." Derek shook his head. "I'm not sure, but we'll find out soon enough." As the officers neared, Derek stepped forward to greet them. "Good afternoon, officers," he said, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "Is there a problem?" One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, glanced around at the gathered crowd before speaking. "We received a report of a noise disturbance," he said, his tone neutral. "Neighbors were complaining about the volume of the music and the number of people here." Derek raised an eyebrow. A noise disturbance? He glanced back at the yard where the music had been playing at a moderate volume, nothing that could be considered excessive. Angela stepped forward, her voice soft but filled with concern. "We're just having a family gathering. It's a celebration for Derek's promotion." The officer looked at Derek, who was still in his casual clothes, clearly not recognizing him at first. "I understand, but we have to respond to all reports. We just need to make sure everything is in order." At that moment, the tension in the air was palpable. The guests exchanged nervous glances, and Angela could feel her children's small hands clutching hers tightly. A shocking realization. The tension in the air was as thick as the late afternoon heat. Derek Williams stood tall, though inside he was trying to balance a simmering frustration with the need to stay calm. His neighbors, the friends gathered in his yard, were watching closely, their festive mood drained by the unexpected arrival of the police. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond, waiting for him to show what kind of leader he truly was, both as a father and the new police chief. Derek knew that this was no simple noise complaint. It was something deeper, something uglier. But his mind didn't linger on that for long. His focus shifted back to the officers, who were standing stiffly in front of him. Derek recognized one of them, Officer Reed, a younger cop who had only recently joined the force. The other officer, however, was unfamiliar to him. Their faces remained impassive, though Derek could sense a shift in their demeanor. He knew this drill all too well. Angela stood beside him, one hand clutching Christine's small hand, her face tight with concern but trying to stay composed. Little Josh was leaning against her, wide-eyed and confused, his childhood innocence unable to grasp why the police had shown up at their family gathering. Derek put a reassuring hand on Angela's shoulder before turning back to Officer Reed, his voice steady. "Officer Reed," Derek began, nodding slightly to acknowledge the younger cop. "As you can see, this is a peaceful family gathering. There's nothing going on here that would warrant this kind of response." Reed's eyes flickered with recognition. The officer stiffened, clearly caught off guard. His partner, the one Derek didn't know, raised an eyebrow and glanced at Reed for confirmation. Derek watched the unspoken exchange between the two officers. He could see Reed's initial discomfort growing into something more. Something was starting to click in the young officer's mind. "Wait, Chief Williams?" Reed finally asked, his voice uncertain but growing with realization. Derek gave a small nod, confirming the younger officer's suspicions. He watched as the color drained from Reed's face. The officer took a step back, as if he suddenly understood the gravity of the situation and the mistake that had been made. His partner, however, was still catching up, a look of confusion settling in. "Chief Williams?" the other officer asked, bewildered, his eyes scanning Derek more closely now. Derek let out a sigh, crossing his arms. He hated having to pull rank in situations like this, but at this moment it was unavoidable. "Yes, I'm Derek Williams, the new police chief. I was sworn in just 2 weeks ago. And this," he gestured around at the gathering of friends and family, "is my home. And these are my guests. There's no disturbance here." The realization hit Officer Reed like a brick wall. His mouth opened slightly as he tried to process what was happening. He quickly straightened his posture, looking visibly shaken by the mistake. "I didn't realize, sir. We were responding to a call from a neighbor. They reported a disturbance." Derek nodded calmly. "I understand that you're doing your job, but there's no problem here, Officer Reed. I'd like to know who made the complaint." Reed hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously at his partner. Sir, it was Mrs. Gray. She's the one who called it in." Derek wasn't surprised. He had sensed for a while now that Mrs. Gray had an issue with his family. Her cold stares, her reluctance to greet them whenever they passed by, the thinly veiled comments about keeping the neighborhood quiet, all of it pointed to something deeper than just an aversion to noise. But even knowing this, the realization stung. He had hoped that his appointment as the town's first black police chief might bring a sense of unity, but it seemed there were still those unwilling to accept him or his family. Before he could respond, a voice cut through the air, a voice filled with contempt and anger. Mrs. Gray herself had appeared at the edge of his property, her wrinkled face set in a scowl. She marched up the driveway, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her lips were pursed in a way that made her entire face look pinched. "What's going on here?" she snapped, her voice shrill as she approached. "Why haven't you stopped this party? I called you to deal with this nonsense." The officers turned toward her, their posture growing rigid. Reed shot Derek a helpless glance, unsure of how to handle the situation now that their superior was involved. Derek remained calm, though inside he could feel a flicker of anger rising. He wasn't going to let this woman ruin his family's celebration, but more importantly, he wasn't going to let her instill fear in his children. Angela, sensing the tension, pulled Josh and Christine closer to her. Her eyes flicked between Derek and Mrs. Gray, silently willing her husband to handle the situation with the grace and authority that he always did. But her heart ached, knowing what this moment was doing to their children. This was supposed to be a happy day. Now it was turning into a painful lesson in the ugliness of prejudice. Derek stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Mrs. Gray, as you can see, the officers are here and they've confirmed that there's no disturbance. We're within our rights to have a family gathering on our own property. There's no reason to shut this down." Mrs. Gray's face flushed an angry red. She glared at Derek, her eyes narrowing. "I don't care what they say. This is my neighborhood, and I won't have it turning into some sort of a carnival. This is a respectable community. We have standards here." Derek's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "We've lived in this neighborhood for over a year, Mrs. Gray, and we've respected every rule and regulation. This is no carnival. It's a family gathering to celebrate my new position, a position I hold as the new police chief of this town. There's nothing unlawful about that." The words hummed in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, Mrs. Gray froze, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. It was clear that she hadn't expected this. Derek's new role as police chief was something she had either been unaware of or had refused to acknowledge. You're the new chief," Mrs. Gray stammered, her voice faltering. She looked from Derek to the officers and back to Derek, her expression flickering between shock and indignation. "Yes, Mrs. Gray," Derek said, his voice still calm but now carrying a hint of steel. "And I'd appreciate it if you would stop trying to disrupt my family's day." For a few seconds, Mrs. Gray stood there, grappling with the realization. Her face, which had been red with fury moments ago, began to pale. The gravity of her actions, the weight of her assumptions, were finally beginning to dawn on her. But still, she wasn't ready to back down. This isn't right," she muttered, though her voice had lost its bite. "I've lived here for years, and I won't have it ruined by—" "By what?" Derek interrupted, his voice low but firm. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "By families like mine? By people who don't look like you? Is that what this is really about, Mrs. Gray?" There it was, the question that had been looming over the entire situation. The truth that Mrs. Gray had been trying to deny even to herself. She faltered, her eyes darting to the officers, to the neighbors who had now gathered in the yard, watching with silent disapproval. "I," Mrs. Gray began, but she couldn't finish. The words died in her throat, choked by the weight of her own prejudice. Derek let the silence linger for a moment, then he stepped back, turning toward the officers. "I think we've resolved the issue here. There's no disturbance. You can go back to your patrol." Officer Reeves, still looking slightly rattled by the turn of events, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. We'll take our leave." He turned to his partner, and the two officers made their way back to their cars, casting one last glance at Mrs. Gray before driving away. As the police cars disappeared down the street, the crowd that had gathered in Derek's yard remained quiet, watching as Mrs. Gray stood there, still frozen in her own embarrassment and shame. The fall of Mrs. Gray's pride. The moment after the officers drove away seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Mrs. Gray stood frozen, her face an unsettling blend of shock, humiliation, and simmering resentment. The neighbors who had gathered in Derek's yard were still watching her, some with quiet disdain, others with barely concealed pity. A celebratory mood that had once filled the air was now replaced by a heavy silence, thick with the weight of everything that had just transpired. Derek turned away from Mrs. Gray for a moment, taking a deep breath to regain his composure. His wife, Angela, moved toward him, her hand finding his. She squeezed it, offering silent support, her eyes filled with the mixture of pride and concern that only a wife could carry. Their children, still wide-eyed and tense, clung to her side, the innocence of their youth having been tested in a way that no child should have to endure. They had seen something today, something ugly that Derek had hoped they wouldn't have to face so soon. But there was no going back now. The truth had been exposed. Mrs. Gray's anger, once blazing and uncontrollable, now seemed to fizzle, leaving behind only a tired, confused woman. She had built her life around control, around the belief that her position in this town, her reputation, granted her authority over the neighborhood and those in it. But now all of that was crumbling, the foundation of her identity shaken by the realization that she had no real power here. Not anymore. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted nervously around the yard, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But all she found were neighbors who had once greeted her politely, now looking at her with expressions of disappointment, some even disgust. The reality of her isolation was slowly sinking in. She was alone in this moment. For the first time, Derek saw something break in Mrs. Gray. It wasn't just a pride. It was something deeper. The woman who had spent years looking down on people who didn't fit her narrow view of what this town should be was now being forced to confront her own reflection. And she didn't like what she saw. Derek knew this wasn't over. Racism and prejudice were never vanquished in a single conversation or confrontation. They ran too deep, tangled in generations of misunderstanding, fear, and entitlement. But something had shifted today, and he wasn't going to let it pass without making it count. He took a step toward Mrs. Gray, his eyes softening just slightly. "Mrs. Gray," he began, his voice low but firm, "I don't think you fully understand the damage you've done today. Not just to my family, but to yourself." Her eyes flicked toward him, still filled with anger. But now something else, something like fear, began to creep in. She opened her mouth to speak again, but Derek didn't give her the chance. "You see," he continued, "what you did wasn't just about a party. It was about control. You thought you had the right to decide who gets to be comfortable in this neighborhood, who gets to feel welcome, and who doesn't. But that's not your decision to make." Mrs. Gray bristled at his words, her lips pursing in that familiar way, but Derek pressed on. "You call the police on a family gathering, a family who has done nothing but try to be good neighbors to you. You want to shut us down, not because of noise, but because we don't fit into your vision of what this neighborhood should be. But let me tell you something. This town isn't yours to control. It belongs to everyone who lives here, and that includes us." For a moment, Mrs. Gray looked as though she might argue. Her eyes flashed with the last remnants of her pride. She glanced around the yard, perhaps hoping to find support among the neighbors, but what she found instead were the cold, distant stares of people who had long since grown tired of her antics. Behind her, Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind-hearted woman who had lived in the neighborhood for years, shook her head disapprovingly. Next to her, the Simons, a young couple with their 2 toddlers, exchanged quiet whispers, their faces grim. Even old Mr. Johnson, who rarely left his porch, was watching from across the street, his expression stern and unwavering. Mrs. Gray's hands, which had been clenched tightly at her sides, began to loosen. The lines around her mouth deepened, and for the first time since she stormed over to confront Derek and the police, her shoulders slumped just slightly. It was a small movement, but it spoke volumes. The fight had gone out of her. Derek noticed it too. He didn't press any further. He had made his point, and there was no need to grind it into the ground. Instead, he turned back toward his family, signaling to Angela and the kids that it was time to shift focus. Angela gave him a nod, her eyes soft with understanding, and gently guided Josh and Christine back toward the backyard, where the guests, still watching, began to stir. Slowly, the tension that had gripped the party started to fade, replaced by the murmur of quiet conversations as people began to process what had just happened. But the moment wasn't lost on anyone. The confrontation had shifted something within the community. Derek could feel it. A subtle undercurrent of tension that had always existed between certain neighbors, like Mrs. Gray, and others was now out in the open. There was no hiding from it anymore. As Derek made his way back to the center of the yard, Mrs. Gray still stood frozen in place. Her eyes, which had once held such venom, were now clouded with confusion. She seemed lost, unsure of what to do next. The woman who had once wielded her privilege like a weapon now found herself disarmed, with no one to back her up. Suddenly, she took a step back, then another. Her retreat was almost unnoticeable at first, but then she turned, her face flushed with humiliation, and hurried back toward her house. She didn't look at anyone as she left, her eyes fixed on the ground, her steps quick and unsteady. It was as though the weight of her actions had finally caught up to her, and she couldn't bear to face the consequences. The moment she disappeared behind her front door, the tension in the yard seemed to lift just a little more. A few of the guests exchanged glances, then began to talk quietly among themselves. A tentative smile spread across Angela's face as she knelt down to reassure Josh and Christine that everything was going to be all right. Derek, feeling the weight of the confrontation finally start to lift from his own shoulders, turned to the gathering. His friends and neighbors, who had been so tense and uncertain just moments before, now seemed ready to move on. The day wasn't lost after all. It had been shaken, yes, but not destroyed. And in that moment, Derek knew that something important had been gained, not just for his family, but for the entire community. As the guests slowly returned to their conversations, Derek took a deep breath and walked over to the sound system. He adjusted the volume just slightly, allowing the soft hum of music to flow through the air once again. It wasn't as loud as before, but it was enough to signal that the party was still on. They weren't going to let this day be defined by the hate and fear of one person. Angela came up beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. "You handled that perfectly," she whispered, her voice full of admiration. Derek gave her a small smile, though the weight of the confrontation still sat heavy in his chest. "I just hope she learned something," he said quietly, glancing toward the spot where Mrs. Gray had stood moments before. Angela nodded. "She'll have to, eventually. People like that, they can't stay blind forever." But Derek wasn't so sure. He knew that prejudice ran deep, and for some, it was nearly impossible to untangle from the fabric of their lives. Still, he held on to a shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Gray would reflect on what had happened today. Maybe she would come to understand the hurt she had caused not just to his family, but to herself. "I don't know," Derek murmured, glancing toward the house where Mrs. Gray had retreated. "I guess we'll see." Mrs. Gray's long night of reflection. Inside her home, Mrs. Gray sat in the dark, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. The house, once a place of comfort and familiarity, felt foreign to her now, alien, almost. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than ever had before, each passing second a reminder of the confrontation she had just endured. The events of the day replayed in her mind like an old film reel, one that wouldn't stop no matter how much she wanted to turn it off. Every word Derek had said, every stare from the neighbors, every moment of shame she had felt as the police officers explained who Derek really was, kept resurfacing, taunting her. Her thoughts spun in a dizzying loop of frustration, confusion, and, most uncomfortably, regret. She wasn't used to feeling like this. Her life had been built on a sense of order, control, and certainty. Mrs. Gray had always known her place in the world, or at least she thought she had. For years, she'd been the unofficial gatekeeper of the neighborhood, the one who knew everyone's business, the one who felt responsible for maintaining a certain standard in the community. To her, the party in Derek's backyard had been a disturbance, an affront to the quiet order she so fiercely protected. But now she couldn't help but question whether that order had been hers to protect in the first place. She had always believed that people like Derek didn't belong in her neighborhood. It wasn't about race, she told herself, at least that's what she wanted to believe. No, it was about the noise, the disruption. But deep down, she knew there was something more to it, something uglier. And that truth was clawing its way to the surface now, refusing to be buried under the justifications and rationalizations she had used for years. Mrs. Gray shifted in her chair, her gaze falling to the photo on the mantel. It was a picture of her husband, Frank, who had passed away almost a decade ago. In the picture, he was young, strong, standing proudly in front of their first home, a modest but charming house in the same neighborhood where she still lived. Frank had been a good man, a man of principles, but also a man of his time. He had strong opinions about who should and shouldn't live in their community, and those opinions had shaped Mrs. Gray's worldview more than she cared to admit. Now, as she sat alone in the quiet house, she couldn't help but wonder what Frank would have thought of today's events. Would he have stood by her, or would he have been disappointed in the way she had handled things? That question gnawed at her, refusing to leave her alone. She had never been forced to confront her beliefs in such a direct and public way before. Sure, there had been other families who had moved into the neighborhood over the years, families who didn't quite fit the mold of what Mrs. Gray thought the community should look like, but she had always managed to keep them at arm's length. A disapproving glance here, a cold greeting there. She had made her feelings clear without ever having to say much. But today had been different. Today she had been called out, exposed for everyone to see. And now she was left with the uncomfortable task of reflecting on what that meant. As the minutes ticked by, Mrs. Gray's mind wandered back to Derek's words. "Why are you so angry at us?" He had asked her that question with such calmness, such sincerity, and for the life of her, she couldn't figure out why she hadn't been able to answer him. She had always been so sure of herself, so certain that her actions were justified. But now, for the first time, she found herself questioning those certainties. Why was she so angry? It wasn't just about the noise, she realized. It wasn't just about the party. It was something deeper, something she hadn't wanted to face for a long time. Derek's family represented change that she had resisted for years. The neighborhood had always been a sanctuary for people like her, people who shared the same values, the same way of life. But now it was changing, and she was afraid. Afraid of losing her place in a world that no longer felt familiar. Afraid of being left behind. But what scared her most, she realized, wasn't Derek or his family. It wasn't even the changes happening in the neighborhood. What scared her most was the possibility that she had been wrong all along, that her actions, her beliefs, had been rooted in prejudice rather than principle. Mrs. Gray shifted in her chair again, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the glass of water on the table beside her. She took a sip, hoping it would steady her, but the knot in her stomach only tightened. The weight of everything was becoming too much to bear, pressing down on her like an unbearable burden. She wanted to find a way to make it right, but she didn't know how. Would the neighbors ever forgive her? Would Derek? That question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. She had seen the way the community had rallied around Derek today. She had seen the respect in the officers' eyes when they realized who he was. And she had seen the look of disappointment on her neighbors' faces when she had stormed into Derek's yard, filled with righteous anger, only to be confronted with the truth of her own actions. The truth was, she had been wrong. But acknowledging that truth was the hardest part. It meant letting go of the control she had held onto for so long. It meant admitting that the world was changing, and that maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. Mrs. Gray glanced back at the photo of Frank. In the stillness of the room, she whispered, "What would you have done, Frank? What would you say to me now?" Of course, there was no answer. Frank was gone, and with him, the world that Mrs. Gray had known was slipping further and further away. She could feel it, and for the first time, she didn't try to fight it. She sat there for a long time, lost in her thoughts, the clock ticking on in the background. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet again, the sounds of the party having faded into the night. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was unsettling, filled with the ghosts of her past decisions, her past prejudices. As the hours passed, Mrs. Gray found herself returning to one thought over and over again. She got to make it right. She didn't know how yet, and she didn't know if Derek or the others would ever forgive her, but she couldn't live with the weight of the shame any longer. Tomorrow, she would go to Derek's house. She would stand in front of him, and she would apologize. It wouldn't erase the pain she had caused, but it would be a start. It was the least she could do. But for now, she sat in the dim light of her living room, alone with her thoughts, her shame, and the faint hope that it wasn't too late to change. The pride that had once fueled her actions was gone, replaced by a quiet humility she hadn't felt in years. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there nonetheless, a flicker of humanity in a heart that had grown cold. And as she sat there, Mrs. Gray finally allowed herself to cry. The tears were silent at first, but soon they came faster, harder, until she was sobbing, her body trembling with the release of years of pent-up frustration, anger, and regret. It was as if the dam had finally broken, and all the emotions she had suppressed for so long came rushing out in an overwhelming torrent. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Gray felt vulnerable, but she also felt something else, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. She felt hope. The apology and a new beginning. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains of Mrs. Gray's living room, casting soft beams across the room. The sun's gentle warmth was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that had brewed inside her throughout the night. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her body felt heavy, and her mind was still cluttered with doubt. Yet for the first time in years, she had a purpose. She knew what she had to do. Her legs trembled slightly as she pushed herself out of the armchair where she had spent most of the night. Every step toward the door felt like she was walking uphill. It wasn't just the physical effort, it was the weight of the decision she had made. Apologizing wasn't something that came naturally to her. For decades, Mrs. Gray had been someone who prided herself on being right, someone who believed that she knew better than others. But now she felt small, vulnerable. She wasn't used to that feeling, and it scared her. Mrs. Gray paused in front of the mirror by the door, adjusting the cardigan draped over her thin frame. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. What if he doesn't accept it? What if the neighbors never forgive me? These thoughts lingered in her mind, but she knew she couldn't back out now. Apologizing was the right thing to do, and even if it didn't change anything, she needed to try. Her hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment longer than it should have. With a deep breath, she turned it and stepped outside. As Mrs. Gray made her way down the street toward Derek Williams' house, the early morning neighborhood was quiet. The houses around her were still, the occasional bird chirping the only sound breaking the silence. The events of the previous day seemed distant now, but the memories remained fresh in her mind, making each step she took feel like an act of penance. Derek's house was in view now. She could see the remnants of the party scattered across the yard, balloons still tied to the fence, folding chairs leaning against the wall of the house, and a few empty drink cups that had been forgotten in the rush of the day before. It looked like the aftermath of any normal family gathering, the kind she would have admired from afar if it had been any other family. But this time, it wasn't admiration that filled her heart. It was remorse. As she reached the gate to Derek's yard, Mrs. Gray's heart pounded in her chest. Her hands felt clammy, and she wiped them nervously on the fabric of her cardigan. She could see movement through the window. Derek was in the kitchen, moving around, probably cleaning up from the party. She hesitated for a moment, fear creeping into her mind once again. What if he slams the door in my face? But she couldn't let her fears win. She needed to face this to own up to what she had done. With a resolve that surprised even herself, Mrs. Gray took a step forward and knocked on the door. The sound seemed to echo louder than she expected in the quiet morning air. She immediately regretted it, her heart pounding even harder in her chest. For a few agonizing moments, there was silence, and then she heard footsteps approaching the door. When Derek opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to something more guarded. He stood tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Mrs. Gray couldn't help but notice how tired he looked. The previous day's events had clearly taken a toll on him as well. "Mrs. Gray," he said, his voice neutral, though not unkind. "What can I do for you?" She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out right away. Her throat felt tight, and for a moment she wondered if she would even be able to get through this. But then she looked into his eyes. those calm, steady eyes that had faced her rage the day before without anger, and something shifted in her. "I'm here to apologize," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything I said, for how I acted. It wasn't right, and I know that now." Derek didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, as if he was weighing her words carefully. The silence between them felt heavy, but Mrs. Gray pressed on, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "I let my fears get the best of me," she admitted, her hands wringing together nervously. "I saw your family, your party, and I thought I was protecting something. But I wasn't. I was just being selfish and cruel." She looked down at the ground, unable to meet his gaze anymore. The shame she had felt the night before was bubbling up again, threatening to overwhelm her. She could feel her eyes stinging with tears once more. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," she said quickly before he could respond. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I spent my whole life thinking I knew better than everyone else, and it's only now that I'm realizing how wrong I've been." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment Derek said nothing. Mrs. Gray could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, and she braced herself for the worst. But then Derek spoke. "Mrs. Gray," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I appreciate you coming here to say that. It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong, more than most people have." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't expected him to be so gracious, so understanding. After everything she had done, everything she had said, he still had the kindness to offer her a lifeline. "I won't lie," Derek continued, his expression softening slightly. "What happened yesterday, it hurt. Not just for me, but for my family. My kids were scared. My wife was upset. We came to this neighborhood to start fresh, to be a part of this community. And for a long time, it didn't feel like we were welcome." Mrs. Gray's heart sank. She could feel the weight of his words, the pain they carried. She had been the one to make them feel unwelcome, to make them feel like outsiders in their own home. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. Derek nodded, his expression thoughtful. But he added, "I also believe people can change. And the fact that you're standing here right now, apologizing, tells me that you want to change." Mrs. Gray felt a lump form in her throat. His words were like a balm to the wound she had carried with her since the day before. She wasn't sure she deserved his kindness, but she was grateful for it all the same. "I do," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to change. I don't want to be the person I was yesterday." Derek studied her for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "It's not going to happen overnight," he said. "But if you're willing to put in the effort, then I believe we can move forward as neighbors." Mrs. Gray blinked back the tears that were threatening to spill over. She hadn't expected this grace, this forgiveness. She had come here expecting rejection, expecting anger. But instead she had found understanding. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what else to say." "You said enough," Derek replied, offering her a small but genuine smile. "Actions speak louder than words anyway." For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Gray felt a sense of peace. It was a fragile thing, still new and unfamiliar, but it was there. She had taken the first step, and that was what mattered. As she turned to leave, Derek called out to her one last time. "Mrs. Gray," he said, his voice gentle, "the next time we have a party, you're welcome to join us." Mrs. Gray stopped in her tracks, turning to face him once more. The invitation took her by surprise, but it warmed her heart in a way she hadn't expected. She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'd like that," she said softly. And with that, she made her way back down the street, the weight of the past slowly lifting from her shoulders. It wasn't gone entirely, but for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew there would be days when she struggled with old habits, old ways of thinking. But she also knew that change was possible, and that, more than anything, gave her hope for the future. The world around her was changing, and now so was she. The ripple effect of change. The next few weeks in the neighborhood passed in relative quiet, but a quiet that was no longer uncomfortable. Mrs. Gray, though still hesitant in her steps, began to notice things she had never noticed before. The easy laughter of children playing in yards, the faint hum of neighbors conversing on porches, the soft rustling of trees swaying in the gentle breeze. The neighborhood, she realized, had always been alive with these things, but her own bitterness had kept her from hearing them. The world seemed a little brighter, and it wasn't because the sun was shining any differently. It was because she was seeing it through new eyes. Eyes unclouded by prejudice. Eyes that now sought connection where they once saw division. But despite her apology to Derek Williams, Mrs. Gray knew the real work had only just begun. One conversation, however heartfelt, couldn't erase the years of mistrust, fear, and isolation she had built around herself. Her apology had been the first brick removed from the wall, but the rest of the wall still stood tall, blocking her from truly becoming part of the community she had shunned for so long. One morning, Mrs. Gray sat on her porch, sipping her coffee and staring at the Williams house across the street. The yard was alive with the sounds of children's laughter as Josh and Christine played catch with a few other neighborhood kids. Derek was out there too, sitting in a lawn chair, talking with a couple of the neighbors. People Mrs. Gray had never spoken to in all the years she had lived there. Her thoughts turned inward. For so long, she had prided herself on her independence, on keeping to herself and not needing anyone. But now, watching Derek and his family effortlessly blend into the life of the community, Mrs. Gray felt an unfamiliar pang of longing. She wanted that connection too, that sense of belonging she had convinced herself she didn't need. But how could she start? The shame from the party still clung to her, and although Derek had forgiven her, she wasn't sure the rest of the neighborhood would be so kind. She could feel their eyes on her sometimes, curious, perhaps even suspicious. They didn't know her. Not really. All they knew was the woman who had caused a scene, who had tried to ruin a family's joyful celebration out of spite. Mrs. Gray took a deep breath and set her coffee cup down on the small table beside her. She couldn't let fear hold her back any longer. She had made a decision the day she apologized to Derek. She wanted to change, and change wasn't going to happen by staying cooped up in her house, avoiding the world. It was time to take the next step. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Gray stood in front of her kitchen counter, her hands trembling slightly as she carefully wrapped a plate of freshly baked cookies in plastic wrap. She hadn't baked in years, not since her late husband had passed away. It had been one of the few things that brought her joy in the past, but after his death, even that small pleasure had felt hollow. But today she had dusted off her old recipe book and spent the afternoon baking, the familiar motions comforting her as she worked. She looked down at the plate now, feeling a surge of nervousness. It was such a small gesture, cookies. But it was more than just a plate of sweets. It was her way of reaching out, of extending an olive branch to a family she had wronged. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped outside and made her way across the street to the Williams house. As she approached, she could hear the sound of Derek's laughter mixed with the giggles of the children. She hesitated for a moment at the edge of the yard, suddenly unsure of herself. What if they think I'm trying too hard? What if they don't want me here? But before she could turn back, Derek looked up and saw her. His expression shifted from surprise to a warm smile as he stood and walked over to meet her at the gate. Mrs. Gray, he greeted her, his voice kind. What brings you by? She swallowed hard, holding out the plate of cookies as if it were a peace offering. I thought I'd bring something over, she said, her voice a little shaky. As a thank you for being so understanding the other day. Derek glanced down at the cookies, then back up at her, his smile widening. You didn't have to do that, he said, though his tone was clearly appreciative. I know, Mrs. Gray replied, her voice softening, but I wanted to. It's the least I can do. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Mrs. Gray's nerves threatened to get the best of her again. But then Derek's wife, Rachel, appeared at the door, her face lighting up when she saw Mrs. Gray standing there. Mrs. Gray, how nice to see you, Rachel said warmly as she came over to join them. What's this? Mrs. Gray handed over the plate, her hands still trembling slightly. Just some cookies. I used to bake them for my husband when he was still alive. I thought your family might like them. Rachel's expression softened and she took the plate with a smile. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. Mrs. Gray felt a small flicker of relief. It was a start, just a plate of cookies, but it felt like something more. It felt like the first real step toward healing the rift she had caused. As they stood there, chatting for a few more minutes, Mrs. Gray noticed the way Derek and Rachel interacted with each other, with a deep sense of love and respect that was almost palpable. She hadn't allowed herself to see it before, but now it was clear. This was a family that was strong, resilient, and kind. And she tried to tear them down because of her own insecurities and fears. When she finally said her goodbyes and turned to walk back home, Mrs. Gray felt lighter. The weight of her past actions still lingered, but it was no longer as suffocating as it had been. She had taken the first step, and that was what mattered.